genetics in your body, while some believe that your nature is everything. Okay, so this particular concept has been understood quite a bit even in twins, where twins had been raised in two completely different environments with two completely different food habits. So now what do you understand from twins? They have a similar genetic makeup, right? But now let's just say my twin is in a place where she is probably eating more junk food, and I am in a place or in a household where we eat more of vegetables and fruits, and I don't have processed foods at all, and I'm maintaining my physical activity. Now both of us have a similar genetic makeup, which means you might think that since we have a similar genetic makeup, we would probably be the same, even if whatever she eats. But when you think about the environmental influences, you would say, yes, since her environmental influences are such, certain genes that even I may carry as a predisposition, let's say both of us carry a predisposition for diabetes, but my lifestyle is better. But her lifestyle is bad because she's been gorging on, processed foods, having a bad physical activity. Her chances of developing diabetes or obesity, let's say 20 years after we meet, I will see that I'm completely different physically from her, right? So this is nature versus nurture, although both our natures are the same because our DNA is exactly similar, but her nurture is different. So these studies have been done on twins over, longitudinal studies have been done right through, let's say, teenagehood to their adulthood, where their choices, their environment has been checked, and how it influences their genetic expression has been seen. And that's the reason why we say that nurture does influence a person despite the nature that they carry. Okay, so in certain cases, if genetically you are prone to, let's say, cancer, does that mean that the person will definitely end up with cancer? No, because certain cancers, yes, the chances, let's say BRCA1, BRCA2. Have you heard of those genes? BRCA1, BRCA2, right? So BRCA1, BRCA2 usually are to do with breast cancer and ovarian cancer. Now let's just say that there is a parent, she has suffered from breast cancer, let's say. So it's obvious that if the daughter undergoes a test and if she does show positive for breast cancer, it does put her at a higher risk, which means she will have to get her a mammogram done, once every few years or once every year. But does that mean she will definitely end up with breast cancer? No, because her lifestyle influences or environmental influences also play a major role. Certain genetic issues, okay, there's an example here like Huntington's disease. Now Huntington's disease, definitely, even if you carry a gene variant, there is 100% possibility of the person ending up with Huntington's disease one generation after the other. That's why certain genetic predispositions are so strong in the family. Certain you will observe in some families that one after the other, right from the grandparents to children, they have certain genetic trait that is strongly passed, right? So certain genetic predispositions are stronger, but overall, when we have checked the number of diseases as opposed to how many get expressed, 40% of the 560 diseases with cognitive, that is your brain related disorders, being the most influenced by genetics. So here at least 40% usually get expressed, but there is still 60% that do not, right? So predisposition completely depends on the kind of disease that is in question. Also, it depends on the environmental influences and how much does that environment influence the prevention of that disease is concerned. Okay, so basically what the predisposition talks about is just because you carry a gene does not mean you will end up with that disease, but at the same time, because you don't carry a disease in your genetics does not exempt you from it either, because your lifestyle environment plays a very important role. I have personally seen some people who have developed cancer later in life, but when you look at the family history, there has been none, right? So in that case, it makes you question what exactly happens in your body, how these mutations come up, how exactly your genes express themselves that are sometimes independent of your genetics. So your body is constantly changing every 30, every 35 days. The food that you consume plays a very important role. You remember there was this statement we'd seen in one of the chapters, you are what you eat. Do you know why do we say that? Because every 32 to 35 days, your cells keep replenishing themselves, and mostly with the foods that you consume. Right? I have said this before. If you consume a burger for, let's say, 20 days, you will start experiencing your skin dulling. You will find that you are aging very quickly. You will find your gastrointestinal, symptoms are all, through the roof. But instead, when you start following a diet, let's say even for 5 days, that is clean, you will start experiencing, the changes almost immediately. Because just like earlier, I answered a question, your body detects these changes. Your body registers these changes almost immediately and gives you the reaction or signs to tell you either you're going right or you're going wrong. Okay, so listen to the signs that your body gives you. So predisposition could be responsible for certain diseases. But if you see that you're predisposed to certain metabolic disorders, let's say diabetes or, obesity is, of course, the simplest one that we talk about, but let's say diabetes or cardiac disorders, you can still take it up on you to make sure that you are correcting your lifestyle and diet in order to match up or help you align with your genetics. Okay. So usually this is what is the basis of predisposition. Let's look at certain diseases or disorders that could be hereditary. Now, hypertension alongside, of course, diabetes and cardiovascular disorders, since hypertension is studied mostly under cardiac disorders only, because it leads to cardiac disorders later on, it does affect 1 billion people globally, right? And it is responsible for 7.6 million premature deaths. Now, this is alarming because, of course, when we think about hypertension, BP to, ज़्यादा होता है, ज़्यादातर लोगों का होता है. But this is not talking about just because your BP is, let's say, 140 by 90, you will end up with, it being fatal. No, because hypertension can definitely be controlled before it reaches to a point where it leads to cardiovascular disorders. Because when we talk about hypertension, what exactly is happening inside your body? Your blood is flowing under pressure, right? Which is the reason why certain vasodilators are given in order to make sure that it flows, with a proper, pressure. So in this case, when a person has uncontrolled hypertension, let's say for years together, there is a chance of developing atrial fibrillation. Okay, atrial fibrillation or AF, for that matter, even issues like, left ventricular hypertrophy, which is enlargement of the left ventricle of the heart, happens on prolonged hypertension. If people tend to ignore their blood pressure, so ठीक है, BP है, वो कम होता है, बढ़ता है, it keeps happening. If they keep ignoring it, and if it becomes much, on a prolonged period, it does lead to heart related ailments, because LVF, that is left ventricular hypertrophy, sorry, LVH, or AF, that is atrial fibrillation, can lead to SCD, which is sudden cardiac death. And I'm sure nowadays you'll hear a lot about it, right? It is different from heart attack. Sudden cardiac death is not like your heart attacks. Heart attacks, at least you can save a person through surgery or whatever. Sudden cardiac death is an electrical malfunction. It has nothing to do with, your blood vessels being choked up, which usually happens in heart attacks. So when it comes to SCD, it happens immediately and it is very fatal. So people with hypertension need to be very, very careful, because certain symptoms, apart from, of course, elevated blood pressure, and people get angry very easily, but headache, dizziness, impaired vision, failing memory, these are symptoms that tell you that it has gone too far. So treatment is usually with, of course, antihypertensives, that is ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, etc. But also through diet, like a DASH diet, it does help. And surprisingly, you would know, as per genetics, if you carry a particular gene, okay, variant for MTHFR, you can actually reverse hypertension within 12 weeks. Not reverse exactly, but the systolic, which is the above part of your blood pressure, can reduce by 13 mm of mercury, okay, within 12 weeks of consumption of riboflavin. Riboflavin is nothing but vitamin B2, like we discussed in the last class, right? So the allele that is responsible where it will help is the T allele. So if you carry the genotype TT, the supplementation with riboflavin 1.6 mg per day for 12 to 16 weeks will help you lower your blood pressure up to 13 mmHg, right? Which is really amazing. So in these cases, people don't have to take medications, right? But when it comes to CC and CT, it will not help. So in this case, a person with hypertension will have to follow a strict diet, reduce sodium in all forms, processed packaged foods as well as table salt, switch over to certain salts that have lesser sodium amount, like the mountain salts that we have, while maintaining iodine in the diet. Okay, so riboflavin rich foods are here. Moving on to cholesterol, people who carry a risk variant for cholesterol usually are not able to metabolize fat or cholesterol that easily. And you are aware that your body produces cholesterol, right? Where is it that your body produces cholesterol? Which is the place? Which is the place that your body produces cholesterol? Perfect. So Abhijit sir says liver, which is true. So your liver is the place which produces cholesterol on a daily basis. Now, a lot of people say that, if in case you're taking eggs, you should avoid yolks altogether, which is not true. It is actually villainized for no reason. It is only in the case of a person that has hypercholesterolemia, where cholesterol is really very high, where we say external cholesterol is not required. Your body anyway produces cholesterol, right? So here, cholesterol is produced for a reason and it is good for your body. You need some amount of saturated fat. But when there is abnormal cholesterol, there is high triglycerides, high cholesterol, total cholesterol, bad cholesterol is high. That is called dyslipidemia or hyperlipidemia. Okay, that happens if you carry a gene where your body is not able to metabolize enough cholesterol. Okay, so usually the gene that is identified here is LPL. Two SNPs means there are two kinds of polymorphisms or single nucleotide polymorphisms that could lead to this particular enzyme, that is lipoprotein lipase, to be produced less. What is lipase? Understand from the name, so it's easier. Lipase is something that breaks down fat. So now obviously if this is not working that well, or if it's not produced well, the fat won't break down, which means there would be free floating triglycerides in your system, which could show high in your blood test. So the recommendations obviously has to be low of saturated fat, increase unsaturated, make sure that there's mobility, exercise in order to maintain your cardiovascular health. In this case, sometimes even along with MTHFR gene as well as other genes, even FPO, FABP2 is checked. Also, the gene that is responsible for your vasodilation, right? When we spoke about epinephrine, it also helps in increasing cardiac output. Okay, so that is also very important and it is always checked side by side. Okay, so other than that, avoiding processed and bakery foods, etc., avoiding smoking. So these are other lifestyle changes. And diabetes, we've also discussed in the chapter of clinical nutrition, is of two types, type 1 and type 2. It's characterized by three main symptoms: polyuria, polyphagia, and polydipsia, which means frequent urination, frequent hunger, and frequent thirst. Okay, so when it happens in that way, you need to get your blood sugar checked. But in certain cases where you're suddenly feeling more thirsty and you're having excess urination, you don't have to be alarmed. Sometimes if you drink a lot of water also, you keep having frequent urination, so it does not have to mean that you have blood sugar issues, but you need to get it checked, especially if you do have a family history of diabetes and a strong history at that. And I'll tell you something that's surprising. Whenever I have counseled, I've observed one thing, that the if diabetes was not diagnosed in their family, right? Now, if I tell you that no, my mom and dad, they didn't have diabetes, I am talking about the diagnosis. I'm not talking about genetics. Genetics is what you will know only when you get the test done, right? So a lot of people, they are like, pretty chilled out when it comes to eating sweets and lifestyle thoda sedentary bhi hai to chalega, because मेरी family में कभी diabetes था नहीं, right? That does not mean that your genetics do not carry that particular risk variant. So unless you get it done, you will not know if you are predisposed or not. right? Maybe your parents had a better lifestyle. Maybe they were successfully, able to prevent diabetes, even if they carried the gene and passed it on to you. But then now, if your lifestyle is bad, the gene will definitely be expressed, whether your parents had it diagnosed or no, right? Or whether it was expressed in them or no. Okay, so this is how diabetes usually works, because it's not just genetic, it is also lifestyle induced. So even if you don't carry a genetic risk, does not mean you are, exempt from developing it if your lifestyle is, all really bad. So diabetes usually happens. Type 1, is insulin dependent because your body does not produce insulin. When it comes to type 2 diabetes, usually it happens with the onset of obesity also. The person is obese along with other lifestyle related inadequacies. It does lead to the onset of type 2 diabetes. In some pregnancies, after gestational diabetes, it leads to full-blown type 2 diabetes, depending on the person's genetics. So other than that, there are other symptoms as well, where glucose is leaked into the urine. It's called glycosuria. There is extreme fatigue. And in some cases, there is something called postprandial insomnolence. So that means after you consume food, you tend to feel sleepy a lot. That is also one of the signs that happens in people with diabetes. So numbness and tingling in hands and feet, blurred vision, etc. are other symptoms. But usually when type 2 diabetes becomes prolonged, there are diabetic complications, because diabetic complications happen only after 10 to 12 years of prolonged diabetes, where it starts affecting your eyes, your nerves, your kidneys, right? So you must have heard of something called diabetic retinopathy, diabetic cataract, diabetic neuropathy, and nephropathy. So these are when it affects. So now, what is the main goal? If you carry a risk variant, you need to make sure that you follow guidelines on the basis of the genes that are involved, right? So FTO gene, TCF7L2 gene, C, PPARG gene. So you know about all these three. But what is Adipocuge? So Adipocuge gene, if you see, adipo means fat, right? So it's definitely involved in fat metabolism. It helps in production of the hormone adiponectin. And adiponectin, when it is under-regulated or down-regulated, it increases more fat in your body, especially in certain areas like your stomach, like abdominal obesity or your thighs, etc. So here, adiponectin can be increased or stimulated. So like I told you, diabetes is polygenic disorder. It is not just one gene we are checking. How many are we checking? We are checking 4, right? So this is usually done in diabetes. Now let's understand homocysteine, which we've understood in clinical nutrition as well. When it comes to homocysteine, it's an amino acid produced in everybody's body. The only problem happens when homocysteine does not convert, okay? Which means if you have lack of 3 main factors that will help homocysteine to convert, your homocysteine will be high. So if there is a lack of B12, B6 and B9, which is folate. B9 is folate, right? Or folic acid. So usually when you have deficiency of these 3, which are not uncommon, they are common. So imagine if you have on a prolonged period the deficiency of these factors through your diet, the chances of elevated homocysteine are more, especially if you carry a risk in the gene MTHFR, right? Now, what is MTHFR? It codes for an enzyme called methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. And this is the enzyme, along with the cofactors that I just mentioned, B6, B9, and B12, that helps in the conversion of homocysteine. Okay? So, यहाँ पे क्या हो जाता है? If in case you're not able to convert, homocysteine levels will go up. Now, in that case, what is the genotype? That is protective. So when CC is the genotype, it is a protective allele. But when T allele is present, it becomes an unprotective allele, or it puts you at a risk of elevated homocysteine levels. How can you decide whether you have elevated homocysteine? It is usually if you are aware there has been a strong family history of cancer or heart disease. You can get it checked. And if you have got genetic test done, that's great, because that way you will at least be able to understand if you're predisposed to it more than other people. Okay, so usually people say, there was heart attack, but it happened at an old age. You still aren't aware whether it has happened because of the gene MTHFR or it's happened because of old age. It's always best to check your homocysteine levels, right? So in this case, making sure that you have those cofactors in your diet or through supplementation does help. But what if your homocysteine is already high? So in that case, you need supplemental methyl folate. Okay. In people with elevated homocysteine, even metformin as a drug does not work efficiently or effectively. It will actually lead to even more high levels of homocysteine in blood. So remember, metformin in that case is always coupled up with calcium methylfolate and B12 side by side in order to prevent any increase in the homocysteine levels. Okay, any doubts so far? Any doubts? These are small chapters. I'm sure all of you will find nutrigenomics much more interesting than what it was at the stage of genetics, because this is something you can easily relate to. You know, even if there are the names of these genes and all of that, once you read it at least twice or thrice, you will be able to understand, because genes ke jo naam bhi hai na, they are as per their function. So it's not that difficult to understand what it is responsible for. By and large, mostly it affects either your glucose metabolism or fat metabolism. Okay, all right. Okay, so now let's talk about gluten. What do you think gluten is in? All of you who've studied already know about it, but let's just have answers. Wheat? Any other grain? Wheat is correct. Any other grain? Barley? Yes. Socho, socho. Oats? Um, Oats by itself as a grain, no. But usually when oats is made in factories that have wheat processed, then they do contain through contamination or cross contamination. But oats by themselves don't contain. So that's why they say, na, you need to take steel cut oats or rolled oats instead. You know, instead of the ones that are processed in the same. Easily, whenever you see packets of oats, na, piche likha hua rehta hai, there's a disclaimer. It could be made in factories that process peanuts and wheat, etc. Okay, so all of you have mentioned there's barley, oats. Okay, no. So nachni is ragi. It is a millet. It does not contain. Okay, so this is very interesting for all of you now to understand what exactly is gluten and how can it affect you. Now, how many of you who have got genetic tests done here knows that you're gluten intolerant, or how many of you do find, you know, after consumption of wheat, do you all experience symptoms that are indicating that you could be gluten sensitive? You experience bloating? bloating. Okay. No, everyone else, I'm fine with wheat. Okay. DNA test, lactose intolerance. Okay, so Bappi, so you are lactose intolerant as per your genetics, right? But not gluten intolerant. Okay. So now gluten is a protein. आपने कभी अगर चपाती वगैरह बनाई है, you know that stretchy feeling that you get even when pizzas are made. Have you seen how big, you know, that atta can become up when they are rolling it up? Can you do that with, let's say, oats ka atta, or can you do that with nachni ka atta, bajra, jawar? It's not possible. In fact, it's a headache to make rotis out of just bajra and jawar because, you know, they break every time. The reason being it lacks gluten. Now, gluten is a stretchy protein that's present in wheat, barley, rye, and certain other grains like even dalia, you know, broken wheat, just right? So that also contains, and certain other strains of wheat like, you know, graham crackers or emmer wheat. A lot of people ask me, emmer is like the oldest strain, which contains lesser gluten, of course, because it's a pure strain. So they say, can I have that even if I'm gluten intolerant? Chances, if you're already developed the symptoms, you won't be able to tolerate emmer wheat also because it still contains gluten, but you can opt for buckwheat. So buckwheat is one grain, even if it contains the word wheat in it, it does not contain gluten. So always remember that. But other than that, your millets, like, you know, Abhijit sir just mentioned nachni, that is ragi. Then you have other millets like bajra, jawar, etc. You have oats, you have quinoa, rice. All of these grains do not contain gluten. So how exactly can gluten wreak havoc on your body? You must have heard of a lot of celebrities claiming that, you know, especially not Indian nahi to aapne, you know, celebrities, Hollywood celebrities to suna hi hoga, you know, gluten-free diet. It's become like a fad for people. However, for some people who are actually gluten intolerant, it can be very, very detrimental. Some people follow a gluten-free diet as a fad. Fad yani ki fashion, because it does help in improving your energy levels. I'll tell you one, you know, tennis player, Novak Djokovic. You all definitely must have heard. So he started experiencing a lot of bloating and symptoms because of gluten intolerance. He didn't know that he was gluten intolerant, but he was diagnosed with celiac disease, which is much beyond gluten intolerance. So he had no choice but to quit gluten. But what he observed was when he stopped gluten and switched over to other grains or gluten-free grains, his game improved much more because even mentally, he was not experiencing those periods of feeling low or fatigued that does happen in gluten intolerance. Because let's talk about intolerances as a whole, whether you have lactose or gluten intolerance, what does it affect? It affects your gut, right? Now, your gut is the place where all of your nutrients are absorbed. But what happens if this is the place which gets inflamed? जो nutrients absorb होने हैं वो भी नहीं होंगे, but at the same time the inflammation in your gut is going to give you cramps, bloating, acidity, hyperacidity, and in some researches it has shown that it invariably can trigger depression and anxiety in people with intolerances as well. And the main reason being your vagus nerve that joins your gut and your brain. So if your gut is not happy, you are not happy. It's as simple as that. So you need to understand that gluten is composed of two things, okay? Gliadin and glutenin. Although glutenin sounds more like gluten, but it's the gliadin that is the main issue here. Because in simple words, I just want to tell you, gliadin kya ho jata hai? It breaks into furthermore peptides or chain of amino acids. And these peptides, they form a complex with another structure called HLA-DQ. HLA kya hota hai? It's human leukocyte antigen. It's already there in your body that detects something foreign, and it will create a reaction or inflammation in your body if it thinks that it is a foreign body or something that will harm you. So in this case, normally when gluten, it forms a composite or, you know, a compound together complex with HLA-DQ, it either will give an inflammatory reaction or it won't. But when it does give an inflammatory reaction, it does cause celiac disease. But for people who do not have that much of a great reaction, but still are experiencing some kind of sensitivity, like, stomach cramps, gastrointestinal bloating, etc., it does show that you are gluten intolerant or gluten sensitive. If you do experience that, make sure that you avoid gluten and switch over to non-gluten grains. So symptoms are basically everything related to your gastrointestinal tract, so which mostly gets undetected or just gets brushed aside because we are in a convenient lifestyle. ठीक है, थोड़ा कुछ गलत खा लिया होगा, I may have eaten something wrong. We don't pay attention if it could be intolerances. So for those of you who haven't actually paid attention but you are experiencing any of these symptoms, make sure that you get yourself checked, especially if you have IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. In that case, gluten वैसे भी avoid किया जाता है. Okay. And another thing, important fact I want to tell you all is nowadays the strain of wheat that is coming is very high in the composition of gluten, which is another reason why even people who do not have gluten intolerance through genetics are still experiencing symptoms of gluten sensitivity. Do not confuse gluten intolerance or sensitivity with wheat allergy, because that is completely different. Let's again revise. Difference between allergy and intolerance is allergy is histamine mediated reaction. It will directly give you hives, rashes, anything that you can observe as clinical signs and symptoms. But intolerances is on the basis of your gut and what you feel from within. Okay. So in case of intolerances, the main difference between gluten intolerances and celiac disease is just one. Although in both cases, gluten does give a reaction and it makes you feel ill internally, but celiac disease damages your intestines on a structural level. तो वहाँ पे क्या हो जाता है? It can be easily detected in scans, okay, and colonoscopies. So usually when certain diseases, they kind of overlap with celiac disease. A lot of diseases are having the similar kind of symptoms as celiac disease, which is why it always goes undetected until it becomes very, grave, or it becomes very, major issue. So a lot of diseases like, inflammatory bowel disease or menstrual blood loss causing iron deficiency anemia, intestinal infections, diverticulitis, where there are diverticuli in your pouches in your intestinal tract. Usually when that happens, people think it is diverticulitis or intestinal infections. They don't immediately think celiac disease. But जब वो हो जाता है and prolonged period, the person is still continuing, taking wheat, it completely damages the intestines, and it can actually be fatal in some cases. So here, celiac disease, there are ways of diagnosing. And now luckily we are in a certain progressive time where researchers have found certain blood tests that could indicate a celiac disease. And if in case even that it shows negative, and if the doctors still think that the symptoms are consistent with celiac disease, there is colonoscopies that is done. Colonoscopy is endoscopy. Okay? Usually it is done in your colon region, okay, where they do insert a certain camera and then they check, what is the texture of your intestinal tissues. So usually blood tests में क्या होता है? There is something called auto antibodies. You know what is antibodies? It is directed to attack something foreign. Auto क्या होता है? Towards your own cell. So if there are auto antibodies, which means your body is attacking your own cells. And celiac disease is, you guessed it right by now, it is an autoimmune condition. I'll tell you something that you will not find in many places. It is only in few research papers where type 1 diabetes has been linked with the gene that is connected to celiac disease and gluten intolerance. In fact, in some cases where type 1 diabetes is diagnosed, but the pancreas has not been completely destroyed enough to produce insulin, यानी कि थोड़ा insulin produce होता है, but still the person is on, in fact, a child for that matter. It was one of my cases only that I had taken long back. So in that case, the gene that is responsible, there are two variants. There's DQ2.5 and DQ8. This particular variant, DQ2.5, is also checked in type 1 diabetes, which means if gluten it is causing an autoimmune reaction. It is essentially attacking cells in your body, right? And in some cases, those cells are your pancreatic cells, which is why gluten intolerance can cause the onset of type 2 diabetes, or if it is started much before, you can identify if there is a link between the two in your case. Okay, so see, if you are having diabetes and if you at the same time parallelly you do carry a gene variant, a risk variant for gluten intolerance or celiac disease, you can try and avoid wheat altogether and see the changes that happen. You will definitely find, a change. Okay, so the gene is usually HLA-DQ 2.5 and HLA-DQ 8. So whenever it forms a complex with it, it causes pro-inflammatory complexes, which means this complex is inflammatory in nature. It will cause the attacking of your own body cells. Okay, so what are the variants? Usually, if in case it is a CT variant and a TT variant, which means a T allele is your unprotected one, right? So in this case, there is a high risk for gluten sensitivity. But if you have CC, you are not going to get triggered. Even when it comes to DQ8 gene, here in case of CC and TC, C allele is the one that is unprotected. Here the T allele is unprotected, here the C allele. So it's quite opposite. But here TT, if you carry the risk variant, you do not carry a trigger. Okay, so the recommendations by now, of course, you all will know if it can be so grave, you have to go on a gluten-free diet. And in this case, it is no fad because gluten intolerance does lead to other issues unrelated to your systems. Now, it has known to even cause changes in your skin. It can cause eczema in some people. It has gone to even cause tinnitus, that is ringing in the ears for some people. Okay, Stanza, you disabled host sharing. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So like I was saying, you have to go on a gluten-free diet. In that case, avoid all grains containing gluten. And I also mean pastas and vermicelli and semolina and everything that is made from wheat. So if you see your rava or your vermicelli, all of them, they do contain wheat as well. They contain gluten as well. They're made from wheat essentially. So pay attention to the grains that you consume. There are many grains that you do not have gluten in. So look at the list: quinoa, rice, buckwheat, amaranth, millet, corn, sorghum, teff, gluten-free oats. So you have all of these usually. You can take any of them. Millets basically contain all of your jawar, bajra, nachni. So this is how it is done. Okay, so we are done with gluten intolerance. So let's summarize quickly. Lactose intolerance. Lactose intolerance. Lactose is a sugar. Do you all know what it is made up of? Okay, Abhijit sir, my experience is I reduced tinnitus. Oh, is it? That's amazing. So you were having issues with gluten? How, 1 second, I'll just unmute you.
I don't know whether I have gluten intolerance because I never checked it. But since I've shifted from wheat to jowar, my tinnitus has reduced significantly.
Oh wow! So how did you why did you decide to switch over? I mean, was there a reason why you decided to switch over?
Yeah, it was the bloating reason. So for bloating, I switched to jowar the past 3 months, and it has shown me good. Right now that you mentioned that it can be helpful in tinnitus, I suddenly realized that maybe that can be the reason.
So yes, so in your case, I think you are like an a living example of a change that happens, because when it comes to tinnitus, there have been research papers. I have never had a client so far who's had tinnitus as yet, but I think now you have experienced it, which means you do believe that it could be because of gluten itself. So this is amazing. So you are right now completely off gluten, or you're just taking it every now and then?
I've just stopped eating chapatis and switched over to bhakris. Nothing else. All other things, all the other foods, rava and all these things are going.
But the main, so you could be gluten sensitive. That is
the main staple food. Yeah, the main staple food is switched from wheat to jowar.
Okay, that's good. That's good. All right. Thank you, Abhijit sir, for sharing it with us. So, of course, any of you later on also, once we end, if you all want to share anything about your experiences, it would be wonderful because it's always nice to know, what everyone. So, I am personally gluten intolerant and lactose intolerant. मेरे case में तो दोनों नहीं चलता है. So, I have to completely change. I was diagnosed with it, gluten intolerance at the age of 23. So, that was quite early for me. So, it's been at least 7-8 years now without gluten. So when it comes to lactose, do you all know what it is made up of? Lactose is a sugar, right? Now, if you'll remember the chapter of carbohydrates, you all have seen monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. Do you all know what lactose is? Is it a monosaccharide or a disaccharide? Any guesses? Is it made up of single sugar or is it double sugar? Glucose, we know it's a single sugar, right? It is not a chain of sugars. It's just a single sugar. It's a double sugar. Correct. So it's a double sugar, and I will show you here. So lactose is a sugar that's present in milk, animal milk. Okay. So cows, buffaloes, goats, jo bhi aap lete ho, it is there. Now your body, okay, it needs to produce certain enzyme called lactase to break down this lactose. Lactase breaks your lactose down into glucose and galactose. Now, glucose and galactose are simple sugars, so which directly get absorbed into your bloodstream. But uske liye, lactose needs to break down. If lactose does not break down, in case where your gene is active, where the lactase enzyme is not produced enough, so jo bhi molecules of lactose are not changed or they are intact, they leak into your gut. They go into your gut unchanged, and here the bacteria is going to then ferment it. So for those people, after consumption of milk, you start experiencing bad bloating, stomach pain, or even nausea or diarrhea for no reason, you need to understand that you could be lactose intolerant. And this does not happen thoda sa doodh peene ke baad. People with lactose intolerant that is mild can still tolerate 220 ml, 30 ml chai mein pee liya. That's a different thing. But if you consume like a cup or a glass of milk, for those who are lactose intolerant, you will directly have diarrhea. There is no, changing that. For those people, you have to stop milk, period. But now, what if you are intolerant in predisposition? Okay, as a genetic predisposition here, but you've not experienced those symptoms. Even in that case, you have to make sure that lactose is not there in your diet. At least if you take it occasionally, it's fine. But as much as possible, we ask you to avoid it because gene expression can be underway at any point in your life. Right? So lactose intolerance is a common problem right now. And in India itself, 68% people are lactose intolerant. Some people don't know it, and some people already have expressed it. As far as patients and clients are concerned, there are patients as young as 6 and 8-year-old that have lactose intolerance symptoms, but the parents were like, nahi, doodh peena chahiye, it is good, maybe the child is fussy. No, the child is actually not able to digest lactose in their body and is experiencing symptoms. At that age, children are not going to be able to explain to you that they have lactose intolerance. It is for you to understand. As adults, when we grow up, we do tend to have, bahar coffee pee liya, ya ye le liya, milkshakes pee liya, smoothies pee liya. So all of this have a lot of dairy and lactose in it. Lactose, your body can digest even without lactose intolerant to a certain level. उससे ज़्यादा अगर आप लोगे, भले ही आपको lactose intolerance ना भी हो, but you will experience symptoms because our human body is not supposed to be able to digest it. We are not supposed to consume animal milk. ये तो तब शुरू हुआ when the early settlements during the Neolithic area, the age, they started moving from place to place. So they realized that milk is one food, अगर खराब भी हो जाता है, अगर फट भी जाता है, तो भी it is helpful because उससे they can make dahi, chas. So they could not sit and carry hordes of food everywhere. So milk, they decided, is a complete food. क्योंकि अगर आपको भूख लग रही है and if you have a glass of milk, if you're not lactose intolerant, you'll be full, at least for some time. You won't eat anything. इसीलिए milk was considered as an all food for people at that age. तो तब से क्या हुआ, certain area of people, as in certain percentage of people turned lactase persistent. Matlab, this is a small percentage of people even today that carry that positive and advantageous gene, jahan pe all your life you can have milk, you will have no problem. But it is still a very small percentage which has come from those ancestors in the Neolithic period. But maximum of us, we are not able to digest it after a certain age. So that is lactose intolerance, which means all of these symptoms, bloating, stomach cramps, nausea, diarrhea, will happen after consumption of milk. Dairy, maybe there are other sources like you have dahi chas, you have paneer, etc. But there's always something that you can take. You can take dahi and chas because even people with lactose intolerance are able to digest it well because it's mostly lactic acid. Usme lactose nahi hota hai. But when it comes to paneer, it is still debatable because some people do experience symptoms even after consumption. भले ही पनीर को कटने के बाद खाया जाता है, but फिर भी there is some amount of lactose that does cause problem because of the whey content. Okay. So this usually causes issue in people with lactose intolerance. So make sure you avoid lactose. You can take dahi, chas, etc. or Greek yogurt. Certain cheeses like cheddar cheese is a better option in comparison to the other cheeses that you get by Amul, etc. So in this case, people have different kinds of lactose intolerance. Now, there is something called primary lactase deficiency. So primary lactase deficiency is the reason because of your genetics, which is the main reason for lactose intolerance worldwide. Okay? So in this case, what happens is when you have your enzyme secretion of lactase, okay, it is not produced enough or it decreases with time, usually you're not able to digest lactose. So secondary lactase deficiency may happen not because of your genetics, but because of some damage to your small intestine, which is not able to produce lactase, which does happen in some cases. Okay, so when it comes to secondary lactase deficiency, your body is not able to produce enough lactase because of damage to certain parts of your intestines that produce the lactase enzyme. So in this case, maybe kya hoga? It can be triggered at some point in your life, and that can cause inability to digest lactose. And the other reasons for lactase deficiency, secondary type, could be any other infection that could be related to your gut, like gastroenteritis, celiac disease that we just saw, right? Then you have Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. It is almost like IBS only, but it is follicle symptoms. Then you have chemotherapy, which is done in cancer, right? Then you have long course of antibiotics. You know, whenever we have antibiotics, we usually even lose the taste of, the sense of taste. Usually after a long course of antibiotics, you might have diarrhea, right? That happens because it tends to destroy even the good bacteria in your gut. So उस case में क्या करना है? Whether even if you're lactose intolerant, make sure that you do have probiotics handy. There are a lot of probiotic ampules nowadays, so that even if you go out, let's say अगर गलती से ले लिया ना, if you're out with family and they're having milkshakes, चलो थोड़ा बहुत आपने भी ले लिया, so it should not cause irrevocable damage to your intestines. So make sure that you keep probiotics handy in that case, if at all you're taking. Or better yet is to carry a lactase enzyme drops. You get lactase enzyme drops. So thoda sa you can add to the milk or your coffee whenever you are out, and you can digest it well. Okay? So what are the complications of lactose intolerance? Usually over a prolonged period, it can cause bone malabsorption, bone resorption, wherein your calcium is leached out. In people with lactose intolerance, even calcium from dairy is underabsorbed or it is less absorbed. So here calcium supplements are also very important in that case. Okay, because milk is not only a source of lactose, but it also contains many other good things as well, right? It contains B12, calcium, casein, right? So if you're not having any problem with any of these, lactase enzyme drops or lactose-free milk is the best way by which you can consume milk if you really like it. At the same time, not experience any symptoms or untoward symptoms or consequences of lactose intolerance. So let's talk about the genes. Mcm6 gene or LCT gene usually is tested for the presence of lactose intolerance. If you ask me, what if I want to understand if I am really lactose intolerant right now? Then there is something known as a hydrogen breath test. Okay, so that is a lab test that can be done, but otherwise knowing that you're predisposed to lactose intolerance helps a lot. So MCM6 gene, usually in this case, if you carry a gene variant, it can lead to the lack of the expression of LCT gene. So it indirectly helps the LCT gene in being expressed. And LCT gene, of course, it produces lactase enzyme. So that is under secreted, which is why you can end up as a lactose intolerant. Whether it is primary lactase deficiency or secondary lactase deficiency, the result and the consequences are the same. So which is the protective allele here? So the protective allele is the one second, the GC gene. Sorry, this is supposed to be, no, there is some issue here. Okay, so when it comes to GC gene, it does not carry the risk genotype, which is GG. Okay, so when it comes to the risk allele, which is the GG allele, you will end up with intolerance or impaired lactase production in the body. Okay, so when it comes to the non-risk genotype, which is GC and GA, you can consume milk and milk products. But when it comes to this, you need to go on a lactose-free diet, not lactase, lactose-free diet. I have to get that correct. Okay. So when it comes to dietary guidelines, avoid dairy products except those that you can tolerate. Read labels carefully, because there are a lot of cereals also. They do have lactose in it, especially if it has milk chocolate in it. So milk chocolate also contains lactose. Milk sweets will contain lactose. So make sure that you know what you are consuming. So over-the-counter enzymes, I just told you lactase enzyme is very readily available, and other calcium fortified or high calcium foods, and in some cases supplements, can also help you. So this is a picture that helps you in understanding how much is the lactase percentage. If it is less than 1%, you can easily take. Usually lactose-free milk has about 0.5 or 0.1%, which is like very little lactose that can be definitely tolerated. So maximum किस में होता है? Whole milk is 5%, right? Approximately 5%. Ice cream has 8%. So make sure that you consume. Okay. Okay, let's move on to caffeine. How many of you love caffeine? How many of you cannot do without caffeine? I know one person in my own house. My brother is like a caffeine junkie. A lot of people depend on caffeine mostly because it keeps them awake and productive, right? We're talking about the current scenario, the work scenario, the stressful work scenario, where a lot of people consume caffeine even on lack of sleep. Caffeine can make you feel that you are you're under the impression that you are awake and you can actually do more and get more things done. So how many of you love caffeine? Let's see. Okay, what's the difference between, one second, let me just take these questions first before going. Let's take Divya's question first. For gluten intolerance, buckwheat or khapli wheat? Okay, no, buckwheat will not contain gluten, but khapli wheat will have gluten, so avoid it. Okay, buckwheat does not contain gluten. Khapli wheat, emmer wheat, khorasan wheat, all of them do contain gluten. Okay, now let's take the next question. What's the difference between prebiotics and probiotics? Very good question. So probiotics are your bacteria, the good bacteria that give you a good gut health. But prebiotics is something that's utilized by your probiotics in order to grow, which is your fiber. Okay, so fiber is by and large called as prebiotics. And usually, if you see a lot of these probiotic supplements, they come along with prebiotics in it, like fructoglycans, or for that matter, anything that has fiber in it. Let's say fruits, that is pectins, or vegetables that you consume. Usually fiber is used as a substrate by these bacteria to produce certain chemicals in the body that can make changes even on a genetic level. So they enter your cells, your body cells, and they can affect your gene expression, which is the reason why probiotics and prebiotics, when taken together, actually give you an overall gut health. Because just imagine you're taking probiotics, but your prebiotics are not there in your diet. You will end up with constipation, which is the reason why a lot of people, they take probiotics irresponsibly. They will take a lot of probiotics, but diet mein fiber to kahin pe bhi nahi hai. So that does cause issues as well. So you need to take both of them responsibly. So that was a very good question. A lot of root fibers and onions, etc., tubers, they do act as a very good source or a substrate as a prebiotic. Okay, so you can go through the list of that. I think I have mentioned it in one of the chapters. You can go through it. I will tell you which chapter it is. Okay, so it is there in your syllabus. All right, when it comes to caffeine, now why is it known as a silent killer? Caffeine is a stimulant, and all of us will agree. The moment there is definitely none of us in this room who may not have had caffeine at least once. So it does give a stimulating effect on the brain, but not many of people know that caffeine can either be heart protective or it could be the reason for heart attacks. Okay, so caffeine is a popular stimulant. A lot of people throughout the world use it. Coffee ke jitne shops hai and brands have come out. You know, you have these Starbucks and you have Cafe Coffee Day, Barista, you know, all of these places. And it is regularly haunted by so many people. There will be not one coffee place that you will see empty because that much is the demand of caffeine. But with the increasing cases of, heart attacks that you see, it makes you wonder, is it the overconsumption of caffeine in the new generation that is causing that, right? So now